If you play League of Legends, I want to give you my heartfelt thanks. Your sacrifice has given the rest of us the opportunity to experience one of the best pieces of animation out there. And the thing about good art is, it inspires. So after watching Arcane, I figured, hey, I have a YouTube channel where I talk about how to design fun encounters in D&D, so let's talk a bunch of characters from a story known for having a lot of nuance, turn them all into bad guys for your players to beat, and use that as an excuse to talk about enemy design. This video was made possible thanks to the help of my YouTube members. I don't have a Patreon, so if you'd like to support this channel, this is the best way. Members get my videos a couple days early, they get a private channel on my Discord server, and if you stay as a YouTube member for 6 months or more, you get a $20 discount on my upcoming sci-fi post-apocalyptic tabletop RPG, Flareful. Okay, let's get started. Here is how this thing is going to work. I will give stat blocks to 11 characters from both Season 1 and Season 2 of the show, and yes, that means this video is going to have some heavy spoilers. Every single one of those stat blocks is going to be challenge rating 12, but by just changing the hit points, the armor class and the damage of these stat blocks, you should be able to make them work for any tier of play. When possible, the stat blocks are inspired by the abilities the characters have in the show, but that's not always possible because some of the characters just don't get into fights. So for those characters, I either use abilities from the game or I come up with something unique that I think would be a good fit for them. And finally, those stat blocks are using the new D&D 2024 format. So if it's the first time you've read the stat blocks in that new format, some things might look a bit weird and unfamiliar. I know it felt weird for me to write them. But I just don't want those stat blocks to feel obsolete in a couple months when we get the new monster manual. So let's get started. But rather than just make a bunch of stat blocks, there's also a question I want to answer in this video. How do you build a stat block that will be fun for your players to fight against? One pitfall I have seen so many new game masters fall into is that they only try to make their bosses powerful and scary, but then they forget to make those bosses actually fun to fight. For example, one time I saw a new GM create a big bad evil guy who could cast Dimension Door using subtle spell meta magic as a legendary action. This bad guy was virtually unbeatable. There was nothing the player characters could do to prevent him from running away. Let me tell you, that game did not survive the winter. There's a concept that was invented back in the 80s called the Wang Rod. The idea is that a Wang Rod is the player who will do things that are not fun for everyone else around the table, like pickpocketing other player characters, for example. And then they'll justify it by saying the dreaded phrase, "That's just what my character would do." Thing is, the Wang Rod could have made any other character, but they chose to make a character who wouldn't be fun for the rest of the players. So that excuse they're using is complete nonsense. It's just a deflection of responsibility. But to me, as dungeon masters, we can be Wang Rods too. Except the way a GM becomes a Wang Rod works a bit differently. It happens when we create a bad guy who can do things to the players that are not fun to play against, and then we justify it by saying, "That's just what my boss can do." Thing is, again, out of the infinite possibility space of boss monsters we could have come up with, we just decided to pick one that would put us in a situation where we even have to use that excuse in the first place. So just like when a player is a Wang Rod, that excuse of "that's just what my bad guy can do," to me, it's never a good excuse. It's very easy to make a stat block powerful or scary. We can just pump up the numbers. But that's not going to make for a very fun experience at the table. So once again, the question I want to answer in this video is, how do you build a stat block that will be fun for your players to play against? And unfortunately, when it comes to monster design, the two versions of the Dungeon Master's Guide that we have for 5th edition only includes guidelines for balancing monsters. They don't really include guidelines for how to make a monster fun to fight. So I have come up with a little checklist, and you'll see that every single stat block in this video was built simply following that checklist. First, if you're making a stat block for a solo boss monster, that stat block needs a buffer. Something to ensure that even if you have the worst luck, your super epic boss battle doesn't end after just one round to a single failed roll against a whole person spell. Ideally, D&D's combat is designed to be most fun when it's about 3 to 5 rounds long. longer than that and it can easily get boring, shorter than that and it ends up feeling anticlimactic, especially for a boss fight. So the role of that buffer is just to make sure that the combat lasts at least 3 rounds. In Wizards of the Coast books, you've probably seen monsters with the legendary resistances trait, and this is why it's there. But I've got a whole video about why I think legendary resistances are not super fun for the players to play against, and where I give you a list of 20 alternative traits you can give to your boss monsters instead. So I will be practicing what I preach, and I will be giving each of Arcane's character one of those 20 alternate buffer traits. Second, your stat block needs to introduce some sort of a tactical choice for your players, and it's important that it's your players who are making that choice. It's very easy to introduce tactical choices for ourselves as the GM. We can just give the monsters 70 spells and 40 different abilities and call it a day. But to give our monsters the kind of traits and actions that give our players decisions to make, to me, that is where the juice is. For example, my favorite stat block in all of D&D is the Stone Defender. It's just a tiny little guy with a shield, and he can take a reaction to protect someone else from an attack. So as a player, if you come across some Stone Defenders, you have a choice to make. Do you target the Stone Defenders first so you can get rid of that annoying protection? Or do you focus on the boss, even if it's harder, because the sooner you get rid of that boss, the sooner you stop taking fireballs to the face? Third, your stat block needs a threat, something to give your players a sense of danger. Most of the time it's going to mean at least one attack, but you'll often want to make it a bit more interesting than this. And that's because the number one role of a threat isn't just to tell your players if you don't deal with this soon, you will lose your characters. It's also to give you, as the GM, something to narrate. So by just adding a couple extra effects to your attacks, or adding different kinds of attacks, you can make it easier to avoid repetition and blandness in your descriptions during combat. Think of it this way: which dragon would feel best for your players to slay? The one which makes 3 attacks and you take 35 damage? Or the one whose burning claws cauterize your flesh just as it severs it before flinging you 30 feet away with a swipe of a tail the size of a tree? This is where we get to have our fun as GMs. If you want to make your bad guys scary, imposing, intimidating, don't just toy with the numbers. Instead, make sure you have some fun toys to begin with. And finally, your stat block needs to be balanced. That is usually the easiest step because it's the only thing we actually have guidelines for. So you just apply those guidelines. But it's important that this is always the last step, because you can always balance a fun idea that's a bit too strong or a bit too weak, but no amount of balance is ever going to turn a bad or boring idea into a fun idea. So make sure your ideas are fun first, and then do the 2 minutes worth of grade school level math to make sure they work as intended. Just to be clear, this little checklist of mine is probably just one way among many to create fun stat blocks. So if you've got your own checklist, make sure you share it with the rest of the community down in the comments below. And as a reminder, this video is only about stat blocks, but you can always make a combat encounter fun even with some super boring stat blocks by having some interesting terrain or some narrative stakes. So you don't necessarily have to always put this effort toward enemy design every single time, but to me, it's a nice little bonus to have on top of everything else. So let's see how that looks in practice. I am not going to go through every single stat block just to keep the video short and sweet, but I am going to go through the 5 I think are the most interesting. If you'd like to go through the entire document, it's called Unearthed Arcane. Yes, I know, and the PDF is in the video description. First off is Jinx. She gives us a lot to work with. Her personality and aesthetic have carried a season and a half of this show after all. For her threat, we've got the whole squad. Zapper, the taser gun she comes up in season 2 when she decides that actually she's a hero, so she should leave her enemies alive sometimes. Pow Pow, the minigun which she uses for the rest of season 2 after Zapper fails to kill her enemies twice. Fishbones, the rocket launcher which I obviously had to give infinite range to. And finally Chompers, the grenades filled with smoke powder. So again, for threats, the goal is for me as the GM to have fun. I think Jinx is giving me all I need here. For the buffer, this is what I came up with. Paint the town blue. Jinx has set up traps almost everywhere. At the start of each enemy's turn, roll a d20. On a 5 or lower, a chomper appears at the creature's feet. If you remember my video on legendary resistance alternatives, I divided the alternatives into 4 categories: costly resistances, destructible resistances, multi-phase encounters, and passive threats. This is a passive threat. The idea is that even if Jinx is incapacitated, she is still a threat. And that means it becomes okay for her to get incapacitated in the first place. For her big tactical decision, what I came up with is that Jinx is vulnerable to psychic damage and has a very low wisdom save bonus of -1, but then she has this trait, Tortured Soul. Whenever Jinx takes psychic damage or fails a wisdom saving throw, she goes berserk until the end of her next turn, and while berserk, Jinx must roll 1d4 before each attack to determine which weapon she gets to use for that attack. Then she's also got this reaction, Lash Out. When she takes psychic damage or fails a wisdom saving throw, as a reaction she gets to make 2 extra attacks. So the players have a choice. Do they want to fight a version of Jinx who is in full control of her actions and who can always pick the perfect weapon for the current situation? Or do they want to fight a version of Jinx who has 0 strategy but makes more attacks? Next up is Vi. Vi is much more straightforward. She's a bruiser. Whenever she has a problem, she punches it real hard. And then she has 2 problems instead. For her threat, I wanted to give her punches more punch. And the way I did that was by adding a very strong pushing effect to them. Because to me, that is usually the easiest way to make a melee hit feel more powerful. We don't necessarily have an intuition for how powerful a hit that deals 15 damage is, because your max hit points change every level. So every level you have to relearn what a strong hit is. But we do have an intuition for how powerful a hit that pushes you 30 feet is. And on top of that, the option for Vi to choose where she pushes her enemies makes sure I can easily switch things up in the middle of the fight if they start to get a bit too repetitive. For her buffer, she has a mythic trait, the same kind you would find in Mythic Odysseys of Theros, where when she's reduced to 0 hit points for the first time, she regains all of her hit points and now she takes 2 turns per round instead of 1. This falls into the multi-phase encounter category of traits. The idea is that if your players have an ability which can end an encounter in a single dice roll, you let them do it, but then you design your encounter to have multiple phases, so those abilities only end 1 phase of the overall encounter. As for Vi's tactical choice, she has a reaction taken from the Tanner Rock, a challenge rating 5 monster from D&D, which is basically the more angry version of an orc or the less angry version of a Vi. And what it does is this: when a creature hits Vi with a melee attack, Vi can make a melee attack with advantage against the creature as a reaction. So the players have a pretty simple choice. Do you attack Vi in melee, or try to take her down with ranged attacks? It's not a super deep choice, but you often don't have to do much more than this. As long as there is something that makes it so your players are encouraged to adapt their tactics and not just default to the exact same sequence of actions they've already used in 15 combat encounters already, you're good. That's essentially all we're trying to do here. To make sure that this one encounter gets to stand out and be memorable. It's just that players mostly remember the times when they get to make decisions, so it's actually pretty easy. But you do have to take the extra 5 seconds to actively think about it whenever you design a new combat encounter. It just doesn't happen automatically. Third on our list is the Matriarch of War, Ambessa. Now, to me, Ambessa is what D&D usually calls a warlord. Like, yes, in 1v1 situations, she's probably strong enough to take on just about anybody. But she's also the type of person who will not get into a 1v1 situation if she can help it. She says she values individual strength, but as far as she's concerned, part of her individual strength is that she owns an army, and you don't. So she is not a solo boss monster, and because of that, I did not give her a buffer ability. Because again, buffer abilities, they're here to make sure that the combat lasts at least 3 rounds. But if there are 5 to 10 other creatures out there for your players to care about, that's already providing enough of a buffer. For her threat, I went very simple. She just gets 3 attacks with her chained guitars, but she can give any number of these attacks to her minions instead. Her minions probably deal a lot less damage with their attacks than she does with hers, so to compensate, when Ambessa gives them an order, they get advantage and they also get to move. For her tactical choice, I wanted to give her a slightly different feel than the one we've already seen on the Warlock stat block from the official D&D books. The way Ambessa works is that she's a stance character, a concept that comes from the world of fighting games. The idea of stance characters is that they're kind of like having multiple characters rolled into one, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, so you switch between your different stances based on what the situation calls for. In Ambessa's case, I gave her 4 stances, one for each of the 4 values she tells Caitlyn about in the show: vision, might, guile, and sacrifice. But importantly, each one of those has slightly different counterplay. For example, in her might stance, her allies start grappling your players, so your players will probably have to spend an action or 2 to break those grapples. The 4th character I want to talk about is Sevika. In the show, she gets one of the coolest fight scenes with the slot machine arm Jinx gives her. So of course, that is what's going to be her threat. And you can bet I'm including a jackpot mechanic where if Sevika rolls the same gadget 3 times, she gets to take an extra turn. Her buffer is what I call a costly resistance. The idea is that instead of treating legendary resistances as an independent resource that is only used to turn failed saves into successful ones, you tie the cost of that save to something the players actually care about. So for example, maybe the boss can choose to succeed on any save, but whenever it does, it has to pay 20 hit points. So even if the player's abilities are getting negated, and they still get to feel like they're contributing to the fight. In Sevika's case, her costly resistance is called breaking apart. Whenever Sevika fails a saving throw, she can choose to sacrifice some of her arm's structural integrity to succeed on the save instead. When she does, roll 1d6. The attack corresponding to that number becomes unusable until Sevika finishes a short rest. So because of the way her multi-attack works, if she rolls one of the gadgets she has sacrificed, that attack is wasted. And that means Sevika can choose to save against basically any effect, but every time she does, her damage output is reduced until the end of the fight. Now, the arm is cool and all, but pure randomness doesn't really lend itself to giving your players tactical choices. That's one of the reasons it's important that the Beholder has an anti-magic cone, for example. So for the tactical choice, I decided to also focus Sevika's stat block on another one of her aspects, her role as Silco's enforcer. Back when Silco was running things, he was the mastermind, but Sevika was the one who would get her hands dirty and get rid of Silco's opponents. So I gave her something inspired by the Vengeance Paladin, Death Glare. When she rolls initiative, Sevika glares in the direction of one enemy she can see, designating it as her prey. Sevika has advantage on attack rolls against her prey. By telegraphing who she wants to take down first in this way, you'll let your players strategize around it. If she's targeting a healer, maybe your players will want to have the healer stay further back, maybe have them take the dodge action, etc. And last, but definitely not least, is of course going to be Viktor in his evolved form. To me, giving Viktor a stat block is an interesting little puzzle because he's essentially a god at this point in the story. And normally, you don't really give gods a stat block in D&D because stat blocks describe how a creature can be defeated. And the entire point of gods is that you don't win against them. And that's also the case for Viktor. He can't really be beaten anymore during his attack on Piltover. His skin is harder than any weapon or bullet, and even if you found a way to hurt him, he could just recreate a healthy body for himself with his magic. The best you can hope for is to somehow talk him out of transforming your entire species into emotionless robots, maybe by calling to the tiny sliver of humanity he has left. But to me, that alternative victory condition, which has nothing to do with hit points, that is worth turning into a stat block. As far as threat goes, this is an example of one where the threat isn't actually an attack. Instead, Viktor just teleports 300 feet next to you as a bonus action, and then he heals you. He removes all of your flaws as a human, and that means you're now on his side, working for him. And after he has healed you, he can also evolve you, if you are willing, which you are. Now, I made sure the transformation isn't immediate, that there's a chance it gets interrupted, but to me, that kind of threat is a perfect fit for a god. He's not trying to kill you, that would be barbaric. No, he just wants what's best for you, and he knows what's best for you, even if you don't. That threat also includes a built-in tactical choice. If one of your allies starts to turn, do you try to save them or do you try to stop Viktor? Saving your allies is easier, but if you spend time on that, that gives Viktor time to turn more of your allies into puppets. As for his buffer, well, he's a god, which means he's immune to all conditions and all damage. You just don't win against a god by hitting him hard enough. Instead, you win against Viktor through his flaws trait. Every time Viktor fails an ability check or a saving throw or takes a critical hit, he gains 1 flaw. At the start of his turn, if Viktor has 5 flaws, he disappears, otherwise he loses 1 flaw. Because of this trait, Viktor is the kind of boss that you could defeat by just making a bunch of contested persuasion checks. That's right, your players can finally feel vindicated for all that time they've spent on Reddit by debating your big bad evil guy to death. And that's it for today's video. I hope you were inspired to come up with some cool sandbox for your home game. There's a lot more cool ideas for you to steal in the PDF if you're interested, so go check it out in the video description. Until next time, have a good one.